Last winter, I booked an Airbnb in a small coastal town to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city life. The place was an old Victorian house, charming and full of character. The host, Emily, had excellent reviews and the price was a steal. I arrived in the evening just as a heavy fog was rolling in off the ocean. The house looked even more atmospheric in person, with its creaky wooden floors and antique furniture. Emily had left the key in a lockbox and a note on the dining table, welcoming me and providing the Wi-Fi password. I spent the first evening unpacking and settling in. The house had a slightly musty smell, like it hadn't been aired out in a while, but I didn't mind. I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace and curled up with a book, enjoying the cozy atmosphere. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard a faint, whispering sound. I paused and listened, but it stopped as quickly as it started. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the wind or maybe the old house settling. The first night passed without incident, but the next day, things started to get weird. I went for a walk on the beach and came back to find the front door slightly open. I was sure I had locked it, but maybe I'd just forgotten. I checked the house, but nothing seemed out of place. That night, the whispering started again. This time, it was louder and seemed to be coming from the room directly above mine. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make out the words, but they were too faint. I felt a chill run down my spine and pulled the covers up to my chin. The next morning, I decided to investigate. The room above mine was a small, dusty attic filled with old trunks and furniture covered in sheets. As I looked around, I noticed an old photo album on a table near the window. I opened it and found black and white photos of the house from decades ago, along with pictures of a young couple and their daughter. One photo in particular caught my eye. It was the little girl standing in front of the house, holding a doll. There was something unsettling about her expression, blank and lifeless. I quickly closed the album and decided to leave the attic. That night, as I was cooking dinner, I heard the whispering again. It was coming from the living room this time. I walked in slowly, my heart pounding, and saw the old photo album open in the coffee table. I was sure I had left it in the attic. I closed the album and put it back, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But that night, the whispering grew louder, and I could hear the words more clearly. "Come play with us," they said, over and over. I barely slept that night, and the next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things and left the house, driving away as fast as I could. As I reached the edge of town, I received a message from Emily. "I hope you enjoyed your stay. The house can be a bit lonely sometimes, but it's always nice to have company." I didn't respond. I left a polite but vague review and moved on with my life. I still think about that house and the whispering voices. Sometimes, late at night, I can almost hear them, calling out to me from the darkness, and I wonder, just for a moment, what might have happened if I had stayed. Last spring, I decided to take a short vacation and found a charming little Airbnb in a small town upstate. The house was a quaint cottage surrounded by lush greenery and wildflowers. The host, Jessica, had stellar reviews and the photos looked perfect for a peaceful retreat. I arrived late afternoon, greeted by the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves. Jessica had left the key in a lockbox and a welcome note on the kitchen counter, complete with recommendations for local attractions and restaurants. Everything seemed perfect. The first night, I settled in with a good book and a glass of wine. The cottage had a cozy feel with a fireplace and comfy furniture. As the sun set, I noticed how isolated the place was. It was the kind of quiet you don't get in the city, a bit unnerving but also calming. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud thud. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. I got up and checked the house, but found nothing out of place. I convinced myself it was just the old house settling and went back to bed. The next day, I spent exploring the nearby trails and enjoying the fresh air. By the time I got back, it was getting dark. I made dinner, watched some TV, and then headed to bed. As I was drifting off, I heard the soft footsteps upstairs. The cottage was a single-story house, and there wasn't supposed to be an upstairs. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly walked towards the sound. There was a small attic hatch in the hallway ceiling that I hadn't noticed before. The footsteps stopped as soon as I reached it. My heart was pounding and I felt a cold sweat break out. I stood there for a few minutes, listening, but everything was silent. I decided not to investigate further and went back to bed, leaving the hallway light on. The following day, I tried to shake off the unease and went into town. I mentioned the footsteps to a local shopkeeper and her face turned pale. She told me that the cottage had a history. Previous owners had reported strange occurrences, and some claimed that the place was haunted. I laughed it off, not wanting to believe in ghost stories. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and more insistent. I couldn't ignore them anymore. I found a ladder in the shed and decided to check the attic. As I pushed open the hatch, a cold draft hit me. I shone my flashlight inside and saw dusty old furniture and cobwebs. But in the corner, there was something that made my blood run cold. A small, child-sized chair rocking back and forth, even though there was no one there. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. Suddenly, the hatch slammed shut on its own. I fell on the ladder in my rush to get away, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and called Jessica, but there was no answer. I packed my things in a hurry and left the cottage in the middle of the night. I drove to the nearest hotel and didn't look back. The next day, I left Jessica a message explaining what had happened. She responded with a brief apology, saying no one else had ever experienced anything strange and offered me a partial refund. I never went back to that cottage, and I've been cautious about booking Airbnbs since. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the rocking chair and the footsteps, and I wonder what or who was up there in the attic.